So we're very conscious as we move into a conversation around impermanence that there's a very good chance it's going to raise more questions than it answers. And as always, that's okay. So yeah, just what would you like to say, Damien, at the start of the conversation?
I think I'm also aware this topic can be triggering. So I think a real invitation to stay connected to our ground. So the felt sense of the feet on the floor. If you're sitting, the felt sense of the seat. At times you might just want to take a couple of breaths as well. So really ground yourself as we're having the conversation.
Yes, thank you for that, because that's certainly something that we've been doing as we've been thinking about it together. So a good place to start would perhaps just be, when you talk about impermanence, Damien, what do you mean by it?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure we're going to come on and talk about why this can be helpful for us as coaches to have a deeper understanding. We'll talk about what that means as well. But primarily, we live in a world of change, and I think from my own practice, and we'll probably talk about this, impermanence is a fundamental characteristic of Eastern psychology, and I would say mindfulness-based interventions. And impermanence really means a deep understanding that everything is subject to change and eventually will cease to exist. So again, as I say that, I would just say, take a couple of breaths as you're listening. And on the screen, I've just put a definition, one of the definitions around, impermanence. We can sort of see it here. So really, this is really summing up, saying that everything changes, nothing lasts forever, and it's really talking to the temporary and I suppose the uncertainty that we have in terms of our experience when we really understand this as a principle. Now, intellectually, we can get this quickly and we can say we understand it. But from more of an Eastern psychology perspective, we're talking about a deeper understanding in terms of an embodied understanding and experiential understanding of what this really means. So I'm just going to pause there for a moment, Liz.
Yeah, so I think, and I suppose thank you for naming that, Damien, because I know, as you say, it can sort of hit you here, but it probably may have more of an impact if it hits you here or in your gut. So I think that invitation to, as you say, keep your feet on the floor, because it definitely can, just even starting to sort of engage with it can bring up all kinds of things that might be happening for us around the idea of impermanence.
And the negativity bias, so we tend to go to the bad story. Oh, this means that everything that I love, everything that's important to me, it is going to change and, at some point won't be there anymore. But again, if we think about that for a moment, well, maybe then the deeper understanding points to the fleeting nature of life and why it's important for me to pay attention to my experience and what I love, what I appreciate, what gives me joy. Really there's an invitation there to be more in that, as it's happening. And I think as well, we could also reframe, well, this is also pointing to the fact that this too will pass. And so, when I'm experiencing difficulty, there's a sense of, well, at some point this too will pass as well. So in some ways it can offer a greater sense of resilience and composure as we start to really think about what this means.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Jeanette, for your comments. So, I mean, it might be a moment just to invite everybody just to pause and notice, you know, how do you feel? Where does it sort of land with you? I mean, I'm doing this, probably where it lands for me. So where does it land for everybody? What is that sense of, yeah, what do they notice just even as we start to engage with it? And if you want to share anything into the chat panel, please do. If you want to just be sitting with it, that's also fine. So Damien, how did you come to be interested in impermanence?
Well, I'm just going to say one thing first. Okay, so I think that invitation to notice how it feels, I can see Ali's response there, which is quite a mindfulness practice in itself, to notice what my experience is, you know, so what am I feeling. So I just want to say, if mindfulness isn't kind, it's not mindfulness. So just bring that sense of kindness to yourself as you're noticing what you're with, perhaps. It's just what I wanted to add. And we will talk about how we work with this as well. So the question was, how did I start to become interested in it? Yeah. So I think the short answer is really through my mindfulness and meditation practice is the obvious answer. And I think you know, in terms of really the orientation into the present moment, when whether I've been practicing at home or on retreat, you start to understand this idea of impermanence from a felt sense, from an experiential sense, which I think is where the interest came from. And then, of course, as a coach, quite often I'm working with clients who are experiencing change, and experiencing the difficulty and the reactivity that's there. So again, from an Eastern psychology, they would call that suffering. And so again, it started to raise questions to me about how I could be of most value to my clients when they're in this experience, based on, I suppose, my own experience of impermanence, you know. And it's a life work. I mean, this is something that I'm continually exploring and working with in my own life, of course, you know.
Yeah, and I suppose listening to you, it's that real, potentially it's a real resource for you as the coach to help you work with people when they're experiencing, we might label it positive and negative. We generally often don't like to label it that way, but things that are pleasant, things that are less pleasant, perhaps.
Yeah, and how they're creating that, you know. And again, I use that term respectfully. I suppose that then that led to a whole interest, knowing myself. So, you know, every time you practice mindfulness, I often say it's like holding a mirror, because you really get to see your minds and, you know, how you're creating your experience. And I think, again, as a coach, becoming curious about, you know, how my clients are creating that experience for themselves in that change, was really where this, I suppose, this interest, this inquiry came from, you know.
Well, so that moves us actually nicely into from your work with it, what feels important about it as a way of engaging with the world as coaches.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna just bring up a couple of quotes, actually, Liz. I think I'm going to do this here because they feel relevant. And you know, the first quote from Andrew Holkek, and I believe he's a yoga teacher. I think it's quite a nice quote in terms of what's happening. So the way things appear is not always an accurate reflection of the way things are. We unwittingly project the qualities of stability and permanence onto a reality that is constantly in flux, you know. And Thich Nhat Hanh, you know, it's not impermanence that makes us suffer. What makes us suffer is wanting things to be permanent when they're not, you know. So again, you know, my practice is underpinned by mindfulness, and one of the attitudes that we're always working with as we're in the present moment is bringing more of a non-judgmental attitude to that experience. We're noticing it rather than adding layers. So again, as the group are listening and reflecting and thinking about this idea of, you know, what's creating the reactivity in these moments, you know, often this starts to point to a couple of things, which I suppose I would sort of label. One is often avoidance, and that can be avoidant of how we're really feeling as things change. And then the other piece then are perhaps I suppose the thinking that's happening, you know, the layers that we're adding and the rigidity that can often be there as well, in terms of this idea of making something permanent that's actually not permanent, you know. And again, I'm sure we can talk a bit more about that, Liz.
So yeah, so again, I'm curious about how you, I mean, we'll talk a little bit about how to support clients, a few ideas around that, or our coachees. What else feels really important to you about it, Damien, as a coach?
Well, I think one level it points to, well, I mean, we can go through so many layers with this, is where I'm trying to pause and to think about what would be most helpful. I think there's something here for me around, a bit like anything in coaching, you know, I can take a theory like this and I could apply it to a coaching client. So I'm doing something to somebody else versus, you know, maybe this is touching things for me, and actually I take this away and start to apply it to my own life, you know, for us, which is of course the way we would encourage someone to always go. There's something here for me around the authentic aspect of this, you know, if this is going to be something that would be helpful for me to reflect on with a client, you know, because I think and it may be just my age and where I am at the moment, but a lot of my coaching clients, for instance, are bringing a crisis of meaning at the moment. You know, they've reached a point in their career, and they're really reflecting on the point of this. You know, I actually heard a really nice phrase the other day, which was a soul hole, you know, which I really liked, a
Yeah.
soul hole. And so, you know, I'm a man of a certain age as well, and it could be quite easy for me to become triggered by that, you know. Versus actually this is an inquiry for me in my own life, not the meaning, but this impermanence piece. And so therefore, by doing the work on myself, I have a greater capacity to be with the coachee in a steady way, where their content isn't triggering content for me. I mean, of course, I'm human, so that at some point, if it did, I would take that to supervision. But what I would say is, I think this creates a greater capacity to be steady and resourceful when the coachee are talking about aspects of themselves that might be quite existential, if we use that example of a soul hole, you know.
Yeah, and actually, as you're talking, I'm also conscious of stages of life that,
Yeah.
certainly my experience is, as I've, you know, the older I get, the faster time seems to go. So it's that speeding up. So actually, the sense of impermanence becomes more, perhaps more acute in a way. So I suppose there's something also about recognizing different stages of life in the clients that we're working with as well. And yeah.
Yeah, and obviously, you know, there may be, I've got a quite young coaching client at the moment who, for example, is potentially facing redundancy, and so this is bringing up a lot of emotion for her, you know, in terms of yeah, the future, etc. Which is, but again, there's a difference between the pain. So, say from an Eastern psychology perspective, the pain of the situation versus the suffering, which they would say is optional, you know. So we're not negating that this is difficult, but then it's then sometimes the avoidant strategies that happen that exacerbate the pain, you know, which again, I think as coaches, if we really understand this, it can be a helpful way of working with the client.
Mm. So it really feels like it could be philosophically, it could be a much longer conversation. We definitely could.
Mm.
And you're starting to touch on some things that might, we can perhaps use as coaches to support clients. So yeah, what else is helpful in terms of how we might work with it?
Well, I think before we look at, because I've coming into today, just to say to the group, I did want to give you something a bit more pragmatic and practical that you could always apply. And if we got time, I might take you through a couple of exercises. But I think as a coach, if we just take moments in a coaching session, for example, where perhaps the coachee touches in on emotion, and let's just, because I've been talking about change and often there's a lot of emotion there. Well, actually, if I really understand this idea of impermanence, that again can often help me be a bit more steady in terms of how I'm meeting that emotion. This idea of this too shall pass, So the coach is having a moment, and I mean that respectfully, but I can just, learn to regulate myself and be with that and create a space for that wave of emotion to come through. Or maybe, we get stuck. Maybe there's a sense of stuckness. Well, rather than trying to do something, maybe, if I really understand this, there's a sense of being able to pause and being with it, because there's an understanding that this too is going to change, So I think in micro moments of the session, Liz, it can be really, really helpful as a coach, stops us moving into being helpful, and we can stay being useful to the client in that moment. But I think underneath everything, if we think about the idea of what potentially happens in these avoidance strategies, and you get the idea that often there's avoidance, there's a wanting to move away from it, the reality of the situation, and often the thinking that's going on. And us as coaches, we know the value of really being able to work with what's underpinning that thinking, the beliefs, etc. So what I would say is this is really where the idea of psychological flexibility comes in these moments where we're working with a client, especially as an antidote to the avoidance strategies, which often happened with impermanence. So maybe it's okay, I'll just quickly go in, because I'm just conscious of time, really. As you say, we haven't got much time. So this is just a quote around psychological flexibility, and it comes from a really great book that I enjoyed and sometimes go back to. So acceptance and commitment coaching, which comes from the field of acceptance and commitment therapy / training. And you can see here the definition of psychological flexibility. So fully connect with the present moment in order to engage behavioral patterns that are supporting movement towards a flourishing life, living my values, And from ACT, as it's referred to, in terms of how we create flexible psychological flexibility in the client, it is their model, their Hexaflex. And what you can see on the screen are the 6 strategies that create psychological, 6 processes really that create psychological flexibility. And I thought, in this session, I just wanted to pick out a couple that I think are really, really helpful. I think us as coaches, when we're meeting moments in our life where we understand the nature of impermanence, but also, of course, when we're working with coachees. So I think I'm just going to focus in on those. And again, we haven't got much time. So of course, the present moment, and anybody that's trained with us in terms of mindfulness, orientating the coachee to the present moment, is of course one of the strategies that sit there, and everything that we know from mindfulness practice in terms of this moment-to-moment awareness that we're creating with these attitudes of non-judgment, these attitudes of patience, that patients that create space around that experience so we can observe the phenomena as they're arising, in terms of that experience. And I know, as I say all that, Liz, it links quite closely with Gestalt process as well. But outside of mindfulness and supporting the coachee in an inquiry to be mindful, what I would say is one of the really helpful processes is this idea of cognitive diffusion. So, sorry, wrong slide. So it's down here on the heliflex. So cognitive diffusion. And again, people may have trained in other approaches where other terms are used, such as unhooking from thinking, decentering from a thought, disidentifying from a thought. It's the same process. What we often see when someone is in that moment is they can become quite fixed in terms of their thinking. And actually the sort of worrying thoughts, the busyness that's happening, becomes an interference to them actually experiencing what's happening in the present moment, so they become quite sort of fixed in how they're meeting that experience. And so, again, I mean, the people that have trained with us in session 4 of the mindfulness training you do, when we're looking at actually working with thinking, the whole process of mindfulness, noticing a thought and then bringing your attention back to the breath, as an example, we're creating some space around that thought so we can actually start to notice the thinking that's happening. And in the practice, we're noticing how involuntary a lot of the thoughts are. And actually then after, by noticing that, we can start to discern whether that's helpful or not. So that's an example of cognitive diffusion, that's an example of it. And again, can be so helpful when you're working with a coachee who's very triggered or reactive to the change that they're experiencing. Now, mindfulness isn't for everybody, but what can be helpful is bringing this concept into a coaching session. And it's where, the client can start to realize that thoughts are not facts, they're not real, they're just mental events. It's a story that we're telling ourselves. And so a really nice exercise here, because I want to try and get to a couple of practical tools for the coaches listening, is and you might want to do this actually as you're listening, perhaps think about change that you've got going on for yourself now. And if you've got a notebook with you, just take a moment to write down all the thoughts you're having about the situation. So you could do this in a coaching session, really encourage the coachee to be honest and just write down the thoughts that are happening about the situation, the change that they're experiencing. And you just get them to write all of those down. And then once they've done that, and if you're doing it now, the next part of the exercise, you could either turn the page or you could write it on the other side if it's a piece of paper, is to just write the title of the story that you're telling yourself. So what's the title of the story? And as I say that, I suppose one or two of the things that happen from this idea of cognitive diffusion is there's a bit more space that's created and there's a bit more choice that usually comes for the coachee about whether they choose to listen to that story or not. So I'll pause there, Liz. There's one other piece I'd love to throw in, but just if there's any reflections from you as you're listening to me share that.
Well, there's so much in it, Damien, but I think that last piece, as you say, of really helping someone just create that gap, so they can start to really notice the patterns of their thinking. And also I am really sitting with how, I mean, you mentioned Gestalt and that sort of present moment. And those who know me well will know we often say, well, Gestalt is also something interesting will emerge. I'm really sitting with the power of, and things, it will pass. So as a way of really, you say, that steadiness with with change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you know, how resourcing that can be just as a way of being as a coach.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. So yeah, and thank you for all the comments coming in. Like Mazia said, I also love the idea of that title.
Mm.
I was thinking of some.
Yeah, I was
Go
going to say,
on.
the coaches often can have a joke with them about it, you know?
Yeah.
It can often bring a bit of lightness into the conversation in that moment, which starts to help them see this idea of the suffering that they may be creating around the pain, you know? We're not negating that, it's a difficult experience. I just want to quickly, in a minute or two, just talk about this other component, which I think is so important in terms of when you're working with someone around impermanence, and that's acceptance. Um, and again, this is a very mindful attitude to bring to a present moment experience. And often, you know, the idea of accepting something can feel like passive. It can often feel like resignation, and that's really not the intention behind this whole attitude of acceptance, I would say. So a mindfulness teacher of mine, when I was talking to them about this, they said to me, well, there's a scale, Damien. You know, at one end, you've just got tolerating. You know, if you can't accept it yet, maybe you can just tolerate it. You then have allowing, which I think is more of a helpful word that I often talk to my coachees about. You then have acceptance, and then you have befriending, which is in mindfulness practice where you turn towards the difficulty that you're experiencing. Now, I think allowing is a really helpful word here. So again, a mindfulness teacher of mine, she used the example, it's as though you're just holding something in the palm of your hand. You know, you're allowing it to be there because it's there. That's the reality of it. So you're allowing it to be there. And often that creates space around the situation rather than these automatic reactions that start to happen. So we're letting it be, really. We're not negating it, we're being with it, but in a more resourceful way. And I think this attitude is a fundamental shift in terms of how we're meeting the difficulty of impermanence, you know. And actually, by allowing it, by accepting it, actually I can be more responsive to it rather than reacting, the suffering, the layers that start to happen. So I know we've got a minute, but I just want to say because again, mindfulness isn't for everyone, but a great exercise here, and again, it can involve someone writing something down, is when the coach is talking about the change, get them to think about what they're trying to achieve in terms of, you know, from the change, you know, so what's the outcome they really want to create, so they can write that down on one piece of paper, and then on the other side of the piece of paper you can ask them to write down all the difficult feelings that arise for them when they think about taking the action towards what they want. And again, often the coachee, when they see that, you know, can start to accept that these emotions are part of that experience moving towards what they want, actually. Anyway, we're at time, Liz, but I just wanted to share those.
Yes, so thank you. I mean, it feels really helpful, as you say, to have shared a couple of practical ways that we can work with it. And actually just that scale I thought was really helpful, Damien. You know, that sense of, yeah, and actually it was making me reflect as a coach, where am I on that scale? In terms of if I'm listening to something from my client, you know, how do I allow it or move towards it?